Hey guys, in this video we'll finish our learning log application, style it and deploy it on the internet so anyone can access it. Specifically, we are going to cover chapter 20 of the book Python Crash Course. We'll use Bootstrap to style our application and then use Heroku to deploy it on the internet. If you want to follow along, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Let's get right into it. Until now, we purposely ignored styling our application because we first wanted to make sure that the functionality works properly. But at this point, we can actually start styling our app, and we are going to use Bootstrap as a tool to do so. Specifically, we'll use Django Bootstrap 4 to integrate Bootstrap in our project, and this app downloads the required Bootstrap files, places them in an appropriate location in our project, and then makes the styling directives available in our project templates. So to install Django Bootstrap 4, we need to issue the following command in our terminal. So we're going to use the pip package manager, and then we enter install Django Bootstrap 4, which is going to download the required files and install Bootstrap for us. After that, we need to head over to our application, and in settings.py we need to make a small change. Specifically, inside of installed apps, our list here, we are going to add an additional section called third-party apps, and here we're going to make sure that we add Bootstrap 4 inside. Now, to get a better sense of Bootstrap, we can head over to getbootstrap.com, and here's a page with a number of different examples we can take a look at. And we're going to use some of the templates provided here. As an example, if we head over to the navbar section, we can see what a navigation bar can look like inside of Bootstrap. So the next step, we're actually going to update our template files and make sure that we include Bootstrap to style the application properly. In order to start using Bootstrap, we need to update our base.html template that we wrote before. So for that, we can head over to our Learning Logs application, and inside of Learning Logs we have the templates folder, and therein we have the Learning Logs folder, and here we have base.html, and we need to update that to include Bootstrap. So here we're going to start out and remove the content that was in there previously. We start out by importing Bootstrap 4 by using load bootstrap, and after that we specify that we are working with an HTML file by using doctype HTML, and we also specify that the language of the page should be English. In an HTML file we typically have two main parts, the head section and the body section, and here we specify the head section. The head section doesn't contain any content, but just some meta information about the page itself. So here we first of all specify, for example, the characters that should be used, so UTF-8, and also information such as the viewport, and then we specify the title, learning log, which is going to show up in the browser's title bar when we actually access our learning log application. And then here at the end, we are using one of Django Bootstrap 4's custom template tags, which tells Django to include all the Bootstrap style files that we're going to use. Then of course we are closing our head section, and in the next step we are going to add the body to our base.html file. Now, after we defined our head section, we are now going to add our body section, and we're going to start by defining a navigation bar. Now, the code for the navigation bar is going to be fairly long because we have to make sure that our page works well on a narrow phone screen, but also on wider desktop monitors. So we're going to implement that in stages, and let's start out by adding a body tag. So the body tag is an HTML element that contains the content that users can actually see on the page. And inside of the body page, we are going to start out with a nav tag. So a nav tag is a navigation tag that we can use to indicate a navigation section. So in here we would include navigation links to reach the different parts of our website. Now, inside of our navigation tag here, we are using a class to apply different styling that is provided through Bootstrap. All we have to do is to basically use the class keyword here, and then to assign the various selectors in here. So we have, for example, a selector called navbar, navbar expand, MD, and for example navbar light. All of those are defined inside of the Bootstrap template. And the selector determines which elements on a page a certain style rules applies to. So for example, if you take navbar light, or there's also background light here, these are going to apply a light themed background here. And then we also have selectors such as MB-4. That is short for margin bottom. And this selector ensures that there's a little space between the navigation bar and the rest of the page. And finally, we have the border selector here inside of our nav tag. And the border selector provides a thin border around the light background to set it off a little from the rest of the page. Now, next, after the nav tag here, we are actually going to specify an anchor tag over here. And here we set the project name. So it's going to be called Learning Logs. And again, we apply a class here using a selector, navbar brand in this case. And in here we also have the reference to our Learning Logs index page, so the start page. So whenever we click on Learning Logs, we basically get referred back to that index page. And we also have the class tag again here, and we are assigning a selector, navbar brand. And this selector styles this link so that it stands out from the rest of the links, and it's a way of branding our site. Now after that, we have our button tag here, which has a lot of values attributes added to it. So this button is going to appear if the browser window is too narrow to display the whole navigation bar horizontally. So we make sure that we can also display it vertically on smaller screens. So when the user clicks the button, the navigation element will appear in a drop-down list. And the collapse reference here inside of data toggle causes the navigation bar to collapse when the user shrinks the browser window or when the site is displayed on a mobile device with a small screen. Now let's have a look at the next section of our navigation bar. We have a div class here, so we open a new section of the navigation bar. A div is an element that basically has its own block and separates different parts of our website. And div is a shorthand for division. And typically we build a page by dividing it into sections and then defining the style and behavior rules that apply to that section. So this div here, this is the beginning part of the navigation bar that will be collapsed on narrow screens and windows. Now after that, we have an unordered list element here, and here we define a new set of links. So Bootstrap defines navigation elements as items in an unordered list with style rules that make it look nothing like a list. So every link or element that we would need in the navigation bar can be included as an item in one of these lists. So for now, we only have a single element, which is our link back to the topics page. Now after that, we are going to add another UL element here, unordered list, and we begin a new set of links by using this tag. And of course, we can have as many groups of links as we need on a page, and this will be the group of links related to login and registration that appears on the right side of the navigation bar. So here we apply a new selector, ML-auto, and this is short for margin left automatic. So this selector examines the other elements in the navigation bar and works out a left margin that pushes this group of links to the right side of the screen. Now after that, we are actually checking if a user is authenticated or not. So if a user is authenticated, we're going to display this section here, otherwise we're going to ignore it. So if a user is authenticated, we have a number of list items, so the various entries inside of our unordered list. And here in the first entry, we are going to greet the user by writing hello followed by their username, and we are actually using a span element to accomplish that. So the span element styles pieces of text or elements of a page that are part of a longer line. We already learned about the div element that creates its own division on a page. Compared to that, the span element is continuous within a larger section. At the end of the section here, we are going to close our div element, and we are also going to end the definition of our navigation by writing this /nav. So this is closing out the nav tag that we opened up here. So there's still a bit more we need to add to our base.html file. Specifically, we need to define two blocks that the individual pages can use to place the content specific to those pages. And for that, we are going to add a main tag to our page. And the main element is used for the most significant part of the body of a page. And here we are using the Bootstrap selector container, which is assigned in the class attribute here. And that's a simple way to group elements on a page. We are then placing two div elements inside of that container, over here and over here. And the first div element contains a page header block. And we're going to use this block to title most pages that we want to include. And to make this section stand out from the rest of the page, we are going to apply some padding below the header. And padding refers to the space between an element's content and its border. So for that we are using the selector pb-2. And that is a Bootstrap directive that provides a moderate amount of padding at the bottom of the styled element. And in contrast to that, a margin is the space between an element's border and other elements on the page. So we want a border only at the bottom of the page, and therefore we're using the border bottom Bootstrap selector here. After that we have our second div block, and that contains the block content. And finally we are just closing this by closing the main section here, body and HTML. Now if we now take a look at our application, we can start our server if we haven't running it at the moment. And then if we head over to the page, we can now see we have a styled page, which is basically the beginning. So here we have our learning logs link, we have our topic section, and if we're not signed in, we have the option to register or sign in. And below that we have the container we specified. And since we're using Bootstrap, we can also optimize it for mobile use. So if we actually head over to our browser and we head over to more tools, developer tools, we can actually have a look at what this looks like on a mobile device. If we click on this little icon up here, we can toggle between the desktop view and the mobile view. And if we are on a mobile view, we can see that now we don't have as much horizontal space, and therefore we're having this little hamburger icon here. And if we click on that, we can actually see those topics that were included in the horizontal top bar on a larger screen. They're actually included in here, so topics, register and login, and we can basically display or hide that. So it's automatically optimized for mobile use cases as well. Alright, now that we updated base.html, we can continue with updating the various pages that we created. So let's start out with index.html. And to update our homepage, index.html, we'll use a Bootstrap element called a Jumbotron, which is basically a large box that stands out from the rest of the page. And it can contain anything that we want. So typically it's used on homepages to hold a brief description of the overall project and a call to action that invites the viewer to get involved. So let's have a look at index.html, and we're starting out by telling Django what we're about to define that should go inside the page header, by adding this block page header here. Next we're going to set up our Jumbotron, and the Jumbotron is basically just a div tag with a class of Jumbotron applied to it. So inside of the Jumbotron are three elements. The first is a short message, track your learning, which is the heading. And we are assigning the display-3 selector to our class to add a thinner and taller look to this particular header. Next we have a paragraph tag here where we have a longer message, and that provides more information about the user, what they can do on the learning log page. And next we have a link here, but rather than just adding a regular text link, we are going to create a button by using again our class here and applying the button selector, and that invites the user to register their learning log account. And important to note, we have at the end here this end sign followed by Heroku and a semicolon at the end. That is an HTML entity that looks like two right angle brackets combined. And then finally we close out our page header section here, and we aren't adding any more content to this page, so we don't need to define the content block on this page. So now let's have a look at what this actually looks like. So if we again take a look at our browser here, we can see we now have this Jumbotron section added here with the heading, our paragraph, and then our call to action, which is the register button here. In the next step, we can update the style of our login form. For that, we can head over to users, templates, registration, and open login.html, and we can update it in order to use Bootstrap. To start out, we are going to make sure that we load Bootstrap 4 up here, and then next we are going to define the page header block, which tells the user what the page is for. After that, we have our block content here, and inside of that we are using our form tag to define a new form, and we're using class form and then bootstrap.form to use a bootstrap form to properly style this login page. And this bootstrap form template tag inserts bootstrap styled rules into the form's individual elements as the form is rendered. And then we are also going to use the button attribute here to add bootstrap styling to buttons. So with this in place, let's save this and let's head over to our website again. And now if we select login, we can see that we have an updated login page using the new bootstrap form. Now the only pages left to style are the topics page and then the topic detail page. So let's start out with the topics page. And on this page we are not going to use any Bootstrap 4 template tags in the file, so we don't need to load Bootstrap 4 on top of the page. Instead we have a page header block here and we move the H1 heading topics inside of it. We then style each topic in our topics list as an H3 element to make them a little larger on the page. And we do the same for the link to add a new topic here. So after that we also should make sure that not just the topics page itself but also the topic detail page is styled properly. So let's head over to topic.html, which of course is also inside of our templates learning logs folder. Now this page has quite a bit of content, so we need to style it a bit more than the other pages, and we are going to use Bootstrap's card component to make each entry stand out and really highlight it. And a card in Bootstrap is a div tag with a set of flexible predefined styles that's perfect for displaying a topics entries. So here what we are doing is we are first of all specifying the page header, and inside of that we place the topic name, which is going to be a H3 heading, and then we remove the unordered list that we used previously in the template, and instead of making each entry a list item, we create a div element with the selector card. And this card has basically two nested elements. We first have the card header that holds the timestamp, and then we have the card body, which contains the actual entry, the actual text of the card. So the first entry here is an H4 with the selector card header, and here we have the actual date, so the month, day and year when the entry has been made, and we also have the option to edit the entry. And since we are using the small tag here, that's going to make that entry to edit the entry look a little bit smaller in comparison. And then after that we have our second part of the card, which is going to be specified by the card body selector, which is assigned to class, and that places the text of the entry in a simple box on the card. So let's have a look now at what this actually looks like. And now when we head back to our browser here, we first of all need to make sure that we are signed in. If you aren't, you need to sign in first. And then if we head over to the topics page, we can see the new topics page that we styled. So here we have a number of different H3 elements here containing the various topics. And if you select a topic, we can see the new card view that we specified with the creation timestamp here on top and the option to edit the entry. And then inside of the card actually we have the text, so the actual topics entry text. And we can note that now that we are done styling our application using Bootstrap, the functionality actually hasn't changed, but now it's a lot more pleasant to look at. So typically we would always start with the functionality first, make sure that everything works properly, and then in the second step we can actually apply some styling using, for example, Bootstrap. Now that we have a professional looking project, let's deploy our application on a live server so anyone on the internet can access it. And for that we are going to use Heroku, which is a web-based platform that allows us to manage the deployment of web applications. So to get started we can head over to heroku.com, and over here we have the option to create a new account. Heroku has a free tier that allows us to test the project in a live deployment before properly deploying it. So once we created our account, we are forwarded to Heroku's dashboard page, and here we can later on create a new app. Since we're using Heroku's free tier, there are some limits, for example the number of apps that we can actually deploy and how often people can visit our apps, but for testing purposes that's absolutely sufficient. In order to actually deploy and manage a project on Heroku's server, we'll need the tools available from the Heroku command line interface. And for that we can head over to this page here that actually explains the Heroku command line interface and how to properly work with it. On this page there are also some instructions on how to properly install it on our system, depending on the operating system we are using. We are also going to need to install 3 separate packages that helps serve Django projects on a live server. So in our terminal we first have to make sure that we have an active virtual environment, and once we do have, we have to issue 3 separate commands. First we use pip install to install a package that is required to manage the database that Heroku uses. So here we enter the command pip install psycho pg2 and sets that equal to 2.7 ***. Now if you encounter an error running that command, then I'm going to provide some instructions on how to deal with it in the description down below. When I ran it, I actually had some issues that I had to work around. There seemed to be some error with the dependency that's being installed. But once we have that fixed, once we have installed that properly, we can continue by issuing another command, pip install Django Heroku. And this package, Django Heroku, handles almost the entire configuration of our app that is required to run it on the Heroku server. Then finally we need to make sure that we also install Unicorn, which is a package that provides a server capable of serving apps in a live environment. Now with those 3 steps out of the way, we can now continue and create a requirements.txt file. Heroku needs to know which packages our project depends on, and so we use pip to generate a file listing them. So again, we are in our active virtual environment, and then we are going to issue the following command. So here we write pip freeze greater requirements.txt, and the freeze command tells pip to write the names of all the packages currently installed in the project into the file requirements.txt. We can actually have a look at that file to see the packages and version numbers installed in our project. So let's have a look at that, and here we can see the different packages we installed before and the respective version number. Our learning log application already depends on 8 different packages with specific version numbers, so it requires a specific environment to run properly. When we deploy learning log, Heroku will install all the packages listed in our requirements.txt file that we just created, and it's going to create an environment with the same packages we're using locally. And for this reason, we can be confident that actually the deployed version on Heroku is going to behave just the same as our version on our local system. And that's a huge advantage as we start to build and maintain various projects on our system. When we don't specify a Python version, Heroku will use its current default version of Python. So let's make sure that Heroku actually uses the same version of Python that we've been using so far for the local development. And therefore inside of a virtual environment, let's check out the version we have been using by typing in python --version. So here we have version 3.9.7. And so in the next step, we can actually add that to a new file called runtime.txt that we're going to add to the same directory as manage.py. So let's head over to our text editor, and here we can see we have manage.py. And let's create a new file, which we're going to call runtime.txt. And in here we're going to add the Python version. And let's save that. So this file should just contain one line with our Python version specified in the format here. And we have to make sure that we enter Python in lowercase, followed by a hyphen, and then followed by a 3-part version number. Now next we need to add a section to the end of our settings.py file to define some specific settings for the Heroku environment. So let's head over to settings.py, and here at the very bottom of the file, just below the My Settings section here, we're going to add a new section to specify the Heroku settings. So here we are first going to import the Django Heroku module and then call the settings function. And this function modifies some settings that need specific values for the Heroku environment. Next we need to create a proc file. A proc file tells Heroku which processes to start to properly serve the project. So in order to create that, we want to make sure that we are in the same directory as where we have our manage.py file. And then we are just going to create a new file called proc file. And when we open that up, we have to add a single line in here. And this line tells Heroku to use Unicorn as a server and to use the settings in learning log/wsgi.py to launch the app. And finally, the log file flag at the end tells Heroku the kind of events to log. Now once we have that set up, we are going to install and use Git to track the project's files. So Git is a version control system that allows us to take a snapshot of the code in our project each time we implement a new feature successfully. And if anything goes wrong, we can always go back to a previous working snapshot of our project and basically reinstate our project at that point in time. And each snapshot that we take is called a commit. So Git is a really good way to try implementing new features without having to worry about breaking our project. So let's first of all have a look if we already installed Git. For that we can just type in git --version, and if you see a result, we have Git already installed. So in my case here I have version 2.21 installed, and in the next step we can then start configuring Git. So for that we can type in git config --global user.name and then the username we want to work with, and we can do something very similar for the email address. So here we would type in the email address. I already configured that, so I'm not going to repeat those steps. But once we have set that up, we then need to make sure that we only track the files we actually want to keep track of, because we also want to ignore some files. For that, we are going to create a new file called gitignore inside, again, of the directory where manage.py is located. So here we can use the touch command and type .gitignore. It's important to add that dot at the beginning because that's a hidden file. And then if we head back over to our code editor, we can actually update those files. So here we head over to gitignore and we want to add 3 different files in here and directories. So everything inside of our ll_env environment we want to ignore and not commit, then PyCache, and then anything related to SQLite 3. And the reason for that is the ll_env directory, we can create that automatically at any time, so we don't have to commit it. And the PyCache directory here contains cached files, the .pyc files that are created automatically when Django runs a py file, so we don't want to track that either. And we also are going to work with a different database, so we also don't need to keep track of the SQLite 3 files here. Okay, with that out of the way, we can head back to our terminal here, and we are actually going to start a new Git repository for learning log. For that, inside of our learning log application, we're going to issue the command git init, which is going to initialize a new empty Git repository at this location. And then we want to make sure that we add everything to our new Git directory. So we're going to type in git add and then the period, which stands for adding everything that we have here, of course ignoring the files we just added to the gitignore file. And now we basically added those files to a staging area. We still need to commit them in order to actually create that first snapshot of ours. So for that we're going to type in git commit, and then we can make sure that we actually add a message along with that. So here we are adding the A and the M flag. The A flag here tells Git to include all changed files in that commit, and the M flag tells Git to record a log message, and of course we need to specify that. So here we're going to add that in quotation marks. So here we're simply going to provide the message ready for deployment to Heroku. Let's confirm that, and now we can see we actually added 41 files here in total, so quite a large number. And now we can type in git status to actually have a look at the current status. So we can see there's nothing to commit and our working tree is clean. That basically means we just issued the commit and there are no changes compared to the snapshot we just took. And we can also see that we are on the master branch, which is a default branch we are working from. If we were to implement additional features, we would basically create a new branch for that and later on merge it back into the master branch. So the master branch is the main branch we are on. Now at this stage we are finally ready to actually deploy our code to Heroku, to actually see it in the browser and make it accessible to the world. And for that we are starting out by typing in Heroku login. And here first of all we need to press any key to open up the browser to log in, or type Q to exit. So here we confirm that and we need to sign in to Heroku. I'm already signed in a different browser here, so that should be fine. Let's head back. So here we are signed in, that's just confirmed at this point. And then we can go ahead and say Heroku create, which basically tells Heroku to build an empty project. And once we confirm that, Heroku is actually going to generate a name which is made up of 2 separate words. So here for example Sleepy Beach, and then a number. And we can change that later on, so we don't have to worry about that. After that, we are going to issue the command git push Heroku master, which tells Git to push the master branch of the project to the repository Heroku just created. So therefore it's important that we actually committed our changes before locally, because this is actually what we commit to Heroku. Now there are a number of different steps being executed here, so it may take a little while to actually complete this, but then we should actually get a URL to actually access our project. And after that we can type in Heroku PS, which is going to tell us how many hours we still have remaining this month for actually running our application for free. Once we have used up that time, we actually won't be able to access the application anymore. There will be an error. And we can also see here the statement that we entered in our proc file before. Now finally, let's type in Heroku open. And this is going to open our application on Heroku. So we can see this is properly deployed. It will be accessible through that URL for everybody on the internet. But while we can see the overview page here, we can't actually use the application yet because we haven't set a database up yet. So we need to run migrate once to set up the live database and apply all the migrations we generated during development. And we can run Django and Python commands on a Heroku project using the command Heroku run. So let's do that. Let's head over to our terminal again, and here we're going to type in Heroku run python manage.py migrate to migrate the database, and Heroku then creates a terminal session to run the migrate command, which we can see up here. Then we are actually running the various migrations, and all of them pass successfully. And now when we visit the deployed app, we should be able to use it just as we did on our local machine. So if we head back over here, we could, for example, decide to register a new account or sign in and then use it the same way. But we won't be able to see any of the data we entered on our local deployment, including our super user account, because we didn't copy the data to the live server. That's normal practice. We don't usually copy local data to a live deployment because the local data is usually test data. So now we could go ahead and we could share that Heroku link with anybody who should be able to actually work with that application and have a look at it. But there are some additional steps we can take to actually refine our Heroku deployment. And specifically what we are going to do is we are going to create a super user, just as we did before when we worked on the local environment. And we are also going to make the project more secure by changing the setting debug to false, so users won't see any extra information in error messages that they could use to attack the server. So let's start out by creating a super user on Heroku. Let's head back to our terminal. And here we can go ahead and we can issue again the command Heroku run. And this time we're going to type in bash, which is basically going to open a terminal through which we can access our Heroku environment. Now from here, let's first take a look what we actually have on here. And we can see we have our learning logs, manage.py, our proc file, and the other files we had also on the local environment. And then we can go ahead and we can actually create a super user by typing in python manage.py create super user. And we can of course provide any name. I'm just gonna call that super user ll_admin. We can leave the email empty, but we need to provide a password. And once we've done that and we see that the super user has been created successfully, we can just type in exit to exit out of the bash environment. Now once we've done that, we can head back over to our application and just add /admin at the end of it, which should forward us to the Django admin screen. And here we should now be able to sign in with the username and the password of the super user that we just created. Alright, and so we signed in successfully, and of course we could add other users here or add some topics, for example, and entries to the page. Now currently our URL is still fairly cryptic and it might be kind of difficult for users to actually remember that. But there's a handy way to actually change that name. And for that, let's head back to our terminal one more time. And here we can type in Heroku apps:rename. And now we can provide a different name. So here we have to enter a name that has not been taken yet. Let's confirm. And then we can see, and if we don't get an error message that the name has been taken, then it has been renamed successfully. So if we type Heroku open again, we can now see that the URL indeed has been changed to the name that we specified. That's of course a very easy, simple step to make our URL a little bit more readable. Now there's a pretty significant security issue that still exists in the way we configured our project and we deployed it. The setting debug equals true in our settings.py file is still set, so let's have a look at that real quick. So if we head over to our text editor and we head over to settings.py, we can see that debug is set equal to true, and there's already a comment added automatically. We should not run our application with the debug turned on in production, so we should definitely change this. The reason is that while we are in the debug mode, we will get quite helpful debug information when we run into an error, but this information could be very instructive for attackers who are trying to break into our application, so therefore we want to disable that on a live server. And we are going to control whether debugging information is shown on the live side by setting an environment variable. Environment variables are values set in a specific environment. And this is one of the ways sensitive information is stored on a server, keeping it separate from the rest of the project's code. So let's update our settings.py files so it looks for an environment variable when the project is running on Heroku. So to do that, in settings.py we are going down to the very bottom again. And here inside of our Heroku settings we are first of all going to import OS, the OS module. And then we're going to check whether we are actually on a debug environment or on a production environment. And our method here, os.environment.get, reads the value associated with a specific environment variable in any environment where the project is running. And if the variable we're asking for is set, the method returns its value. And if it's not set, the method returns none. And using environment variables to store Boolean values can be confusing. In most cases, environment variables are stored as strings, and we have to be really careful about this. So now that we have made those changes, we can actually see in our text editor here that we made some adjustments. We actually need to make sure that we commit those changes and then also push those changes to Heroku. So let's get back to our terminal. And here we are going to add a new commit, and we're providing the message set debug based on environment variables. Let's use git status again, and so we can see we are on the master branch and there's nothing to commit, so everything has been cleaned on our working tree. So in the next step, let's actually push our changes to Heroku. So again, we are typing in git push Heroku master, so we are pushing our master branch to Heroku with the updated files, so with the changes to settings.py. And here Heroku recognizes that the repository has been updated, and then it rebuilds the project to make sure all the changes have been taken into account. It doesn't however rebuild the database, so we don't have to run our migrate command again. Now we can set the value we want for the debug in settings.py through Heroku. And we're going to do that by issuing the following command: Heroku config set debug is set to false. And whenever we set an environment variable on Heroku, it automatically restarts the project so the environment variable can take effect. So let's check out if our application is more secure now. So again, we could issue Heroku open. Instead, we can also go back to application. To check that it's actually more secure than before, we can issue a URL that has not been defined. So just some random URL here. And now we see a generic error message, not found. On our log development, that doesn't give away any specific information about the project. So before we had like a really detailed stack trace here with all the errors that happened. That's no longer the case because now we set our debug value to be false. So therefore we are now in the production environment and we don't show that information anymore. So it's more secure. Now when we run into an error such as this one here, typically it's either a 404 error or a 500 error. So a 404 error usually means that our Django code is correct, but the object being requested doesn't exist, such as this is the case over here. A 500 error usually means that there's an error on the code that we have written, such as an error in a function in views.py. And at the moment Django just displays a very generic error message here, but we can also provide our own templates for a 404 or 500 error and actually serve that instead of the default error message. So let's do that, and to get started, let's head over to our text editor again. And here inside of our learning log folder, we need to create a new directory called templates. And inside of that, we are going to create two separate files. First, a file called 404.html, which includes the code to be displayed or the text to be displayed when we run into a 404 error. And then also a separate HTML file for our 500 error. So if we first take a look at 404.html, we again have our default extends line here, and then we have a block page header that we display, and here we just add the text, the item you requested is not available, in parentheses 404, which is an H2. And then in the 500.html file we have a similar text, just of course we say that we have an internal arrow, so a 500 arrow here. Now once we have made both of those changes, we need to still make a small change to our settings.py file. So we can open that up by heading over to learning log and then clicking on settings.py. And over here, if we scroll down a little bit to the template section, we need to make a small change to our value here for dirs. So this was empty before, and here we are now going to type in os.path join base directory and the templates folder that we just created. And this change tells Django to look in the root template directory for the arrow page templates. Now we could check this locally if that works properly. If we wanted to do that, we would head back up here and change the debug value from true to false and run the local environment. We, however, need to make sure that before we actually deploy that change to our Heroku environment, we change it back to debug is equal to true. So with those changes in place, we can actually commit those changes to Heroku. Let's first add everything that we changed to our Git repository, and then we are going to commit this with a commit message. So here we write added custom 404 and 500 arrow pages, and of course we need to again commit this to Heroku by typing in git push Heroku master. And as a quick little note, if you run into an error actually running git push Heroku master, we actually need to update our settings file slightly and make sure that we add the import OS line here above our template section, so actually this command can be issued properly. And then if we encounter an error, we can just add that again using git commit with the A and the M flag and the message, and then we can run git push Heroku master and then it should work properly. So let's actually take another look at our application. Let's reload the page, and now we can see we instead get our custom 404 message that we just defined before, so we have actually our own message that is being displayed here. Now when a user actually heads over to the topics page after having signed in and tries to request a topic that doesn't exist, we can see that we get a 500 error message here. And that happens because Django tries to render the non-existent page, but it doesn't have enough information to do so, and so the result is a 500 error. In this situation, it would be better to actually display a 404 error, and we can implement this behavior using a Django shortcut function called getObject or 404. And this function tries to get the requested object from the database, but if that object doesn't exist, it raises a 404 exception rather than a 500 error, and we can use that in its place. So to do that, we can actually update our views.py file in our application. So in our text editor, inside of learning logs, we can open views.py, and here we are importing from Django shortcut. We already import render and redirect, so we can just add the additional module, which is called getObject or 404. And inside of our topic method here, we can just adjust this line here, and instead of directly getting the object, we are going to use our getObject or 404 method instead. So here we are calling getObject or 404 on the topic, and we provide the ID, and the result is going to be stored back in topic. So to actually see that change, let's once again make sure that we commit that change. Since we didn't add a new file, we don't have to issue the git add command. We can just issue git commit with the A to add the file and the M for the message flag. So I'm just going to call it improve error handling 444. Let's do that. And then we also need to push it, of course, to Heroku. Now once we committed that change to Heroku, let's have another look and let's reload the page. And now we can see it now correctly displays a 404 error message, so we also handled that specific case. So at this stage we've fully developed our application and we also deployed it to Heroku. If in the future we want to make any further development, any further changes for this application, we would typically follow the same process. So we would first make any changes that we need in our local project, and if we actually create a new file with that, we need to make sure that we add it to our Git repository using the git add dot command, And any changes that require database migration will generally need this command because each migration generates a new migration file. And then we need to issue the command git commit with the AEM flag and our commit message to actually commit it to our Git repository. And then we need to push our changes to Heroku using the command git push Heroku master. And again, we also need to make sure that we migrate our database if that's required. And finally, we would then issue Heroku open to open our application. And if we want to issue any database commands, for example, for the migrations, we would always preface that with Heroku run and then the regular command that we would actually also issue on our local environment. One important note, we did one thing that we typically wouldn't do on a production environment. What we did is we committed our secret key, which is entered in settings.py. So here we have our secret key. Typically on an actual production environment that we actually want to work with, that could be a security issue, and therefore we would typically not commit that. So if that's important in the future, we should research how to better handle that and how to address that without actually having to commit the secret key. On a final note, if we want to delete our project at a later stage, all we need to do is to sign into Heroku, and here we are going to find an overview of our applications that we deployed, and we can also delete them. All we need to do is to click on the name of the application, and then we can select settings, and at the very bottom of the page we then have the option to delete our app. All we need to do is to enter the name here, and then we would need to click on delete app to confirm it, and this is going to delete our app. So whenever we have, for example, reached the number of applications supported in Heroku, we would follow those steps. We learned how to use the Bootstrap library to style our application and make it look nice. We also learned how we can use Heroku to deploy our application to the internet. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to add them in the comment section down below.